Okay, if everyone can kindly find their seats, we're almost ready to begin the panel. This panel today will be discussing, do some reasons for abortion exacerbate discrimination against persons? Advances in prenatal diagnosis, as well as human rights theory, have raised new questions about some reasons for abortion. For example, are sex-selective abortions discriminatory against women? Some experts see the aborting of women as not only discriminatory, but potentially detrimental to the structure of society, while others state that a mother should be allowed to have a boy if she wants a boy, and a girl if she wants a girl. Another question we will examine, does choosing abortion because the fetus is disabled threaten the value and dignity of people with disabilities? And lastly, do certain forms of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and the possibility of designer babies undermine human diversity and the structure of society? Both those opposed to and those in favor of abortion share concerns regarding these questions, as well as related issues raised by new and developing biotechnologies. To begin addressing these concerns and exploring the potential for common ground are four distinguished panelists. We have Bernard Dickens from University of Toronto, Faculty of Law, Eva Kittay from the Department of Philosophy at SUNY Stony Brook, Lisa Schultz from Terence J. Murphy Institute for Catholic Thought, Law and Public Policy at the University of St. Thomas, and Bill Hurlbut from Stanford University School of Medicine Neuroscience Institute. The structure of this panel will be each person has 10 minutes for opening comments, followed by 20 minutes of moderated discussion, and then 20 minutes for audience Q&A. We'll end with 2 minutes from each panelist for concluding comments.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here and to confront, first of all, the challenge of language. The program speaks about disability, and people with particular characteristics may regard themselves as being differently able, but not disabled. So what a disability is problematic, and one has to be careful about not using insensitive language. We had an example of this yesterday. John Finnis objected to the program speaking of fetuses. He was concerned that the language ought to be babies or unborn children. He also described those who terminate pregnancies as abortionists, which is very stigmatizing language. Those who undertake termination of pregnancy don't use that description for themselves. And this was a sad example of selective sensitivity. We therefore have to be careful and cautious when we are addressing what we may regard as disabilities, that those who possess those characteristics may not see in that negative light. I'm going to raise a number of points in a rather staccato fashion to keep within the time limits. These are points for further reflection, discussion, refutation, even qualified derision if need be. The first point to make is that some reasons for which couples may decide to terminate pregnancies may indeed send a negative message to those living with the characteristics that they would terminate pregnancies rather than have their children inherit. That is, the danger is clear. that some reasons for termination of pregnancy may well constitute discrimination, stigmatization of those who live with us in the community. And the challenge is to decide what response to make to this. The response I would think appropriate is to counsel and familiarize the couples who have the prospect of children having different abilities from others, being differently abled or being disabled in some language, to show them that those who live with those characteristics can lead enjoyable, fulfilling, rewarding lives, and are not necessarily suffering from burdens and incapacities. The question of whether one can or should limit access to termination of pregnancy, to abortion on those grounds, raises different issues. In my opinion, one should not compel births on unwilling parents, because the birth of any child, whatever its capacities, will take over a major portion of individuals' lives. It will consume their lives. And if the children require very special attention, very special accommodation and nurturing, then to impose that burden on those who are required to bear it at the preference of others seems an undue oppression. And in that sense, I would not support limitations on abortion because of the potential inheritance of the child. There's an additional danger, of course, that if one urges that pregnancies should be continued so that children are born with incapacities that would reinforce the status of those in the community with those conditions, this is really to make an instrumental use of those children. That is, if one urges or requires or compels their birth in order to serve a wider social agenda, then that is to use those children and to use their lives for demonstrative purposes, not necessarily to value them in their own right. So we have to be careful not to make an instrumental use of disabled children in order to buttress the status of those in the community who bear the conditions that they exhibit. The question of sex-based abortion is again problematic. And this is a point at which I believe we have to have the social equivalent of evidence-based medicine, which is evidence-based social policy. The reality in the world is that son preference is common in a number of countries of the world. China and India are the countries that come to mind under China's one-child policy. Many Chinese couples have wanted their one child to be a son, and the demographic consequences of that are now apparent. There are the so-called 10 million Chinese bachelors, that is, young men who have no women in their communities to marry. In the context of India, religion plays into it. There are people here who would have more knowledge of this than I. But the Hindu religion, I believe, requires males to undertake burial rituals to ease the dying person's transition into the next phase of existence, the next phase of life. And in that sense, there is a need, a religious need, to have sons. Whether the religion can evolve, again, is something that I'm not able to address. But we now have technologies that do permit pre-implantation, prenatal sex identification. The techniques apparently becoming easier, relatively simple. The blood test, a serum test, may disclose the qualities of the unborn child, the embryo, the fetus, and that would include a disclosure of sex. And in that sense, we now have technologies that make some preference more easily achieved in countries and cultures where that is regarded as an important value. It may be, though, that this will prove to be a short-term phenomenon, because if the sons who are born by those techniques are to have their own sons, then they have to be able to marry their neighbors' daughters. And if the daughters are not there, then this becomes a dysfunction. So it could be that in a relatively short spectrum of time, women will acquire a scarcity value as the mothers of a future generation of sons. And it could be that this is a short-term phenomenon. But in North America and in West Europe, the evidence is that most people are not interested in recourse to these technologies for the purposes of sex selection, except for the legitimate ground of identifying sex-linked genetic disorders, which are primarily along the male line. So in North America, certainly in Canada, and the evidence is the same from the United States and also West Europe, the United Kingdom, figures from Germany, most people are simply not interested in using these technologies. There is a margin of interest on the part of those who already have a child or two children, and they intend not to have families going beyond 2 or 3, and they want their next child to be the sex other than the one they already have. Or if they have 2 children of the same sex, they want their third and last child to be the other sex. And this description of family balancing does not affect the demographic balance between males and females in the community. On the contrary, it preserves a balance. So we have no grounds for rational control or prohibition of sex-based selection. Clearly, it's better that it should be pre-implantation rather than sex-based abortion, terminating a pregnancy because of fetal sex seems a misuse of technologies, and that can be understandably resisted. But the instinct itself is not especially oppressive and doesn't confront our communities in North America or Western Europe with the sorts of demographic imbalances that countries such as India and China exhibit for the time being. The last point I'll make is the danger of these technologies if applied for purposes of genetic enhancement. It may be that it's premature to consider, as the program says, whether the possibility of designer babies would undermine human diversity and the structure of society. It may be that in future times that may become a real concern, but it seems premature at the moment. And although we know that many of our social responses to technologies are after the event, the field of reproduction is somewhat remarkable in that in many parts of the world there have been anticipatory commissions. In the United Kingdom, the Warnock Committee. In Canada, we had a Royal Commission on New Reproductive Technologies that were dealing with prospective horrors, circumstances that hadn't actually evolved and that some feared might evolve and therefore had to be legislated against. And we therefore have a series of anticipatory laws trying to foresee problems that haven't yet arisen and trying to forestall them. But the experience of most prospective legislation is that it misfires. That is, it doesn't identify the real nature of the problems, and they in fact aggravate them. In that sense, it could be premature to ask if there will be a major impact on society through selecting children positively for certain characteristics. But there is danger in enhancement because that is likely to aggravate the existing gaps between the privileged and the disadvantaged. That is, people of privilege with higher education and usually the higher income and access to resources that go together may well want to have their children conforming to a somewhat artificial stereotype of what children should be and what their inheritance should be. And people without those advantages would be left to the consequences of nature. And in that sense, I think it's appropriate to be cautious about using these technologies, not for the avoidance of disability, but for seeking enhanced abilities that would lead to social division and limit social mobility. Thank you.
Eva, would you like to go next?
13 years ago, perhaps it's 15 years ago, I participated in a Hastings Center workshop that was organized by Eric Perens and Adrian Ash, which issued in a collection on prenatal testing and selective abortion that some of you might be familiar with. I received a letter of invitation, and I had never worked on any issues of disability. I was a philosopher, but I was invited because I'm also the mother of a severely disabled child. She has severe cognitive impairments as well as cerebral palsy, some cerebral palsy, and seizure disorders. The letter that I received suggested to me that I was being invited to speak out against selective abortion. I mean, that it was presumed that I was against selective abortion because I was the parent of a child with severe disabilities. I cherish my daughter in a way that anyone cherishes their child, and perhaps more than most. My daughter is a great sense of joy to me, and she's taught me an enormous amount. I've written a lot about her now. But I did not feel that way about selective abortion or prenatal testing. I felt that this has to be a woman's choice, that as long as we permit abortion, we have to permit selective abortion. Abortion for any reasons, we have to permit abortion for this reason. And what's more, I know I contemplated a selective, I contemplated testing and the possibility that I would abort a child if they had a serious disability. The reason is because I could not foresee that I could take care of two children like this in the way in which I wanted to, in the way in which I could give my whole heart and commitment to both of these children, my time and enough time to raise my son and enough time to carry out a very meaningful career. So I wrote back and saying I would participate, but you have to understand this is my position. I came back from that first meeting somewhat traumatized. I was the only parent there with a disabled child who felt this way. And I was also roundly attacked by some people in the audience with disabilities. And I was speaking to my husband and my son, who actually is a graduate of this university, was a philosophy major here, and he was home. And I told him about our conversations, particularly the expressivity thesis. To my shock, I found that he disagreed with me. I said, if I had contemplated, if I had decided to have an abortion because I had a child that was severely disabled after Sesha and after you, and would you still think that I was expressing the view that a disabled life was not worth living? After all, you've seen what our life together is, and you see how I treasure both of you. And he said yes, he would take that message. So I decided that the way to fulfill my assignment for this volume was to write a paper together with my son. We had an email correspondence. He was off skiing for the year and working as a ski bum, we carried on this conversation, and we had a conversation like we'd never had in our lives. The argument, my son made a number of very astute arguments. He's a very astute guy. And one in particular is noteworthy and has been picked up, particularly by Adrian Ash. And that is the position that if you decide to select on the basis of particular traits, then a family gets to feel more like a club. He was in particular thinking of the eating clubs here at Princeton, where you're admitted because you have certain desirable features, certain capacities. You're smart, you're handsome, you play football, whatever. And if you lose some of those traits, you could get kicked out of the club or become a very undesirable member. And he said it would feel that way rather than a family that simply welcomes whatever child it has. And he said, on the one hand, you could think that, well, I'm really valuable because my parents chose me. But then you begin to worry, well, what happens if I lose these traits? Will I still be desirable? And I have to say that I have no good answer to that question. I have no good answer to that argument. I do believe a family is supposed to be a place of unconditional love. The only response, only two responses I have to that argument is, first of all, I think a family begins with the birth of a child. It's at that point that child can either be taken care of by the mother or by another person. Until the birth, that child is wholly dependent on the mother. And so it has to be for her to make the decision. My second point is that when you have a selective abortion, you aren't necessarily sending any message. Someone might take it as a message, but it's not because you're sending a message. People have tests, they have abortions for many different reasons, and it's at best a very degraded kind of communication, if it's a communication at all. And I think it's a mistake to see it as a communication at all. Let me just give you a little P.S. My son has now 3 children of his own. He and his wife decided not to do prenatal testing. It was Less, I think, on the basis of the arguments he made in the paper, though some of it might have been. He had, after all, a wife to consider. But I can't say that I'm not proud of him for the kind of decision he made. So my own sense of this is a very ambivalent sense. I think the argument that if you have selective abortion, you will decimate the population of the disabled, and therefore people will not be able to understand and appreciate what it means to be a disabled person and to have and value a life, whatever differences that life might bring. I think, if anything imputes the dignity of the disabled, it's the lack of resources and supports. And this is very much, I think, in line with the kinds of comments Dorothy Roberts made earlier. The selective abortion may be an expression of some sort, but the way in which to deal with that problem is to address the sources of that problem, which is a question of resources and education. Thank you.
Some people have spoken about why they do not think it's a good strategy choice or personal choice to participate in this conversation, whether minds can stay open, hearts can stay open. And all I have to say is that being on a panel with Eva Tepe is proof to me that this is a conversation that needs to happen, because I adore that woman so much. The things she's written and the things that she has done, we have such fundamentally different views about the things that we're going to be talking about today, but we have so much in common and so much of the same kind of hearts on these issues that I know conversation is possible. And I want to talk today about the same issue that she was talking about abortions after a prenatal diagnosis of a disability or selective abortions. And specifically, what really intrigued me about this conference was the possibility of looking at something that has struck me as very, very interesting. And these are a set of arguments that have been made in the past couple of years by disability rights activists who defend a woman's legal right to an abortion, but still are starting to argue in different ways that there's something morally problematic about exercising that right after you've had a prenatal test that's shown that your child has a disability. It turns out, I think, and what I want to explore really is that is there common ground between people who are pro-life and pro-choice around this cause? Could disability rights activists who are pro-life join forces with disability activists who are pro-choice around this issue? I think that there are two categories of these kind of arguments being articulated by disability rights activists. And the first of these categories turns out, I think, not to be a fruitful avenue for common ground between the pro-life and the pro-choice camp, for reasons that the arc of yesterday's discussion made very clear. But the second category, I think, does lend itself to some fruitful exploration of common ground between these two camps. The first category of arguments that's being made by disability rights activists who are pro-choice, who are arguing that certain types of abortions, selective abortions, are still morally problematic, is one that's based on issues of consent and autonomy. And these are the same arguments asserted in the past by disability rights groups in the context particularly of assisted suicide. The arguments that are made now in this context, increasingly with the dramatic increase in selective abortions, right? these arguments are now being asserted in this context as well. And the arguments are that these decisions, either the abortion decision after a prenatal diagnosis or an assisted suicide decision by somebody who is severely disabled, they are often based on erroneous and prejudicial assessments of the quality of life of people with disabilities. There are a lot of studies that show that professionals and people without disabilities have a lower estimate of the quality of life of people with disabilities than people with disabilities themselves report. And there is a lot of evidence that professionals in prenatal counseling contexts are often informed by those prejudicial assessments about the quality of life of people with disabilities. So the argument is that in situations where somebody is making a decision based on a prenatal diagnosis, it's a situation involving a lot of stress, a lot of emotional vulnerability, and in those situations, pressure is exerted by medical professionals who internalize and express these prejudicial views about the quality of life with a disability. So the decisions that are made in those contexts are sometimes effectively coerced. They're not free and autonomous decisions. Given that reality, the argument goes, some form of intervention or regulation of that decision-making process doesn't restrict free choice, but actually is necessary to preserve free choice. This category of argument I don't think offers much in the way of common ground for disability rights activists on opposing sides of the abortion debate. For most people, and we saw this expressed yesterday, support for legal right to abortion rests in the premise that the unborn has less of a claim to personhood than the already born, and that gender equality requires that a woman be able to choose abortion. In the face of those premises, the possibility that some disabled fetuses may be aborted based on false information or effectively coerced decisions is simply outweighed by the value of gender equality. At most, there might be some common ground on the issue of better information for women facing such choices, better information for medical professionals, but if that information is seen as negatively pressuring a woman not to have an abortion, even that common ground is going to dissolve. The second category, though, is the category of the expressivist arguments that Eva was starting to discuss. Expressivist arguments against selective abortion after prenatal diagnosis. And I think it's important to recognize there are two types of those arguments. One of them hinges on the same irresolvable tension that dooms the autonomy argument as a source of common ground, but the other does not, I think. The first argument rests on this distinction between, is any particular distinction. The argument is that a decision to abort after prenatal diagnosis is a response to a particular trait of that fetus, rather than a response to some situation of the woman that causes her not to want to have a baby at that time. As such, it expresses a negative or discriminatory attitude toward that fetus. It sends a message about people with disabilities as a whole that's morally problematic. So that's one category of expressivist argument, that there's something morally distinguishable about the woman's decision in a situation like that. But the other aspect of this argument is that the act of screening to prevent the birth of disabled children concretely affects the lives of living, existing people with disabilities, because it expresses and thus reinforces and socially validates the view that people with disabilities are less valued than people without. And the consequence of this screening is a lower number of people with disabilities being born, resulting in fewer advocates for the rights of people with disabilities and a decrease in the social support of for those with disabilities and those who care for them. This argument does not rest on the moral status of the unborn. It focuses on living people with disabilities, our brothers and sisters living among us. And it doesn't rest on an analysis of the morality of any particular woman making such a choice. Its focus is on the social consensus being expressed by all of these decisions collectively. The evidence is irrefutable that prenatal testing for disabilities does result in a decreased number of children with those disabilities being born. Let's take the poster child for prenatal testing for conditions that cannot be treated prenatally, Down syndrome. It's so easy to identify prenatally, and there's nothing that can be done about it. The only way to prevent the birth of a child with Down syndrome after a prenatal diagnosis is to abort it. A 1999 meta-analysis of data from studies worldwide concluded that about 92% of women who receive a definitive diagnosis of Down syndrome choose to abort their children. There's no way of knowing how many of these women are actually aborting babies that don't have Down syndrome, because a lot of the testing is just based on statistical probabilities. But it's clear that the absolute number of babies born with Down syndrome in the world is decreasing as testing becomes more widespread, even though women are tending to have children at older ages, and the risk of having a child with a Down syndrome increases with maternal age. Studies conducted in 2005 and 2004 in the U.S. show that 15% fewer babies with Down syndrome were born between 1989 and 2005, though an analysis of maternal age trends indicates there should have been a 34% increase. This sort of reduction in the total number of people with Down syndrome in this country clearly, irrefutably expresses to the existing population of people living in this world with Down syndrome that there's no widespread social consensus that they are just as valuable and valued as people without Down syndrome. And it doesn't just abstractly express the devaluation of this population, it operationalizes that valuation. This dramatic decrease in the numbers of people with Down syndrome in this country both expresses and will inevitably decrease the amount of social support given to those existing with Down syndrome and those who care for them. The criticism of these expressivist arguments typically are that it's a slippery slope kind of argument. It's an argument that you can't maintain a meaningful distinction between abortion after a prenatal diagnosis and abortion generally. And I, from a pro-life perspective, I agree with that argument. But I think that there is an answer to the slippery slope argument that should be convincing even to a person who wants to continue to defend a woman's right to an abortion generally. And it's the same argument that underlies all of our civil rights laws. We're free to discriminate against our fellow human beings for all sorts of irrational reasons. We could arbitrarily refuse to hire anybody with red hair because a red-haired guy, when I was 16, didn't ask me to the prom, and I really wanted him to. But we as a society have reached consensus that we cannot discriminate in such ways against people who belong to certain protected classes formed by race, sex, religion, disability, national origin, etc. And even when such discrimination may be rational, we prohibit that discrimination. We do that because we as a society have identified that particular protected class as having been systemically subordinated, and we think discrimination based on membership in one of those historically subordinated groups is much more dangerous, resulting in much more serious social harm than discrimination based on personal idiosyncrasies. So all I'm trying to suggest, I'm not trying to argue that the ADA prohibits women from having who had a prenatal diagnosis from having abortions, or even that it should. But what I'm trying to argue is that there is a very venerable model for the view that an act may not be morally problematic if done for no particular reason, but might be morally problematic if done for some particular reason. And in light of the overwhelming evidence of the systemic structure of subordination to which people with disabilities have been subjected in our country's history, and the overwhelming evidence of the effect of a prenatal diagnosis of a disability on the number of people with disabilities being born today, it's legitimate to consider abortion after a prenatal diagnosis to be particularly morally problematic, even if you generally support a woman's right to abortion. So this is an area where I think disability advocates, both in the pro-life and the pro-choice sides, might join forces, at least with respect to trying to change people's hearts and minds, and most importantly, in trying to change people's hearts and minds about the amount of support that should be given to people living with disabilities and to parents of disabled children.
So last weekend I was in Yosemite Valley hiking Half Dome, and on the way home through the rural areas of Central Valley of California, I suddenly came across a billboard that showed an electrocardiogram with the heartbeats trailing off to a flat line, and written over this was the words, "When you die, you will meet God." At the bottom of the sign, there was a phone number. And I thought to myself, well, you know, I've been thinking about the issues of our conference as I was driving. Maybe I can call ahead and get some of the answers. So I was checking the area code, you know, what cosmic zone. It turned out to be a 1-800 number, toll-free call, so I figured that makes sense. Thinking about it, the sign seemed at first to me a little heavy-handed. But then I got to thinking more. Whether we're religious or not, most of us want our lives to add up to something. and something coherent, something aligned with a larger good, to a truth that transcends ourselves and our immediate appetites and ambitions. T.S. Eliot wrote, "Hell is the place where nothing connects." There again, whether we believe in heaven and hell, we all know that a truly moral life is a life that connects, that's consistent, integrated, and coherent, where our thoughts and actions in one sphere of life do not set a situation or a logic of justification that in another realm of life will create unintended consequences. Listening to this conference, especially yesterday's session on the moral status of the fetus and this morning's discussion, it occurred to me that some of the positions being taken pose significant challenges to us, given the opportunities of advancing biomedical technology and the potential scientific and potentially medical uses of studies of embryos that involve the destruction of embryos and uses of embryonic and fetal parts. This brought me back to the difficult discussions, difficult deliberations that I was part of as a member of the President's Council on Bioethics over the 8 years of the previous administration. The first task given to us by the President was to discuss the issues related to stem cell research, and most specifically research and reproductive uses of the potential technology of human cloning. And although this was not directly an issue adjudicating the questions of abortion, it did have very strong roots in the questions of the moral meaning of developing life and the questions of conflicting goods and values. So, as I pondered this and what to say about these matters, it struck me that to outline for you some of the meanings of where we're going in biology and medicine might be of value, and how our fundamental attitudes about abortion might generalize out into realms that dehumanize our general perspectives on broader human life. There's a saying, those who choose the beginnings of a road also choose its destination. So let's ponder this. The first question that comes up even before the question of cloning is the question of the use of the so-called leftover spare IVF embryos. And most Americans seem to think by polls that this is a legitimate use, namely for research purposes, because they're going to die anyway. But I would ask you to ponder this. Most of these so-called leftover IVF embryos are not at the stage of harvesting embryonic stem cells. Many of them have been frozen at the 2-cell stage, for example. And in order to get them to this stage, 4 or 5 days, they need to be very carefully and gently nourished in a laboratory dish. You have to encourage the life of the being to get it to the stage where it's ready for harvesting. And the justification for the use of these embryos raises the fascinating question, well, if it's okay to use these for obtaining embryonic stem cells, well, what other uses could you use them for, because they are going to die anyway? Now, to understand that issue, one has to stop and ponder where we are in the stage of our advancing scientific technology. After approximately 4 billion years of the unfolding of the evolution of life, finally a creature has been created who has the capacity for comprehension and control of the basic forces of life. Over the past 100 years, we dedicated our scientific efforts largely to the study of the molecular components of life, molecular biology, displaced zoology, which is the study of living beings. But now, culminating with the sequencing of the human genome, now as we cross into the new millennium and as we enter into a whole new era of scientific technology, These basic ingredients of life, these basic principles we've learned, are reconverging in the study of developmental biology. Now we're back to the realm of living things. This raises an enormous opportunity for the study of how exactly these basic molecular components knit together the living being of the human organism, how form and function relate, and how pathologies develop. The possibilities for the study of embryos and useful application of their developed parts are absolutely enormous where there are no moral issues. Now, IVF embryos could be kept alive longer and potentially even implanted in an artificial uterus, or artificial endometrium, or even in a woman's womb, with the understanding that since they were going to die anyway, there would be further uses of these embryos. But of course, the issue reaches a much more poignant and difficult level when we ponder what it would mean to create embryos for intentional harvesting or intentional study. And the first question then comes up, well, first of all, how many embryos would we be willing to create specifically for research purposes? The New York Times decried the limited scope of President Obama's executive order, saying other important embryonic research is still being hobbled. It says until that changes, scientists who want to create embryos and extract stem cells matched to patients with specific diseases will have to rely on private or state support. Such research is one promising way to learn how the diseases develop and devise the best treatment. They're referring here to embryonic cloning. Congress should follow Mr. Obama's lead and lift this prohibition so such important work can benefit from an infusion of federal dollars. So how many embryos would be created? As most people here know, the availability of human eggs is the bottleneck in cloning and the creation of embryos. Right now, with superovulation, the average patient can produce maybe 12 to 15 eggs. But there are projects now to coax immature eggs through in vitro maturation, so there could be a much larger number, and even wider possibilities of actually taking embryonic stem cells or their pluripotent equivalents and producing unlimited number of actual gametes, both sperm and egg. As you know, the whole point of embryonic stem cells is they can produce all the cell types of the body. Well, oocytes and sperm are two of those cell types. And here's what Davos Salter of the Institute of Medical Biology in Singapore says. He's a nice guy, I know him personally. You could have millions of gametes that could be combined at will. Today you can't experiment on human embryos because it's considered morally repugnant and they are difficult to get. If embryos could be grown in culture like any other cell line, this problem would disappear. They'd become like any other type of cell line. They would become objects and would be used as objects. He continues, I have no idea what kind of moral value or rights we could give these embryos. We'll probably go through the same agonizing as we did with IVF. It could be terrible to begin with, but then it'll become a fact of life. Maybe 20 to 30 years from now, we'll read in newspapers that someone made 20,000 embryos and studied their development, and we'll decide it's okay. The second issue is, how late would we keep these embryos alive? There again, the question is, what do we think the moral status of the embryo is? And let me just, for this purpose, quote you one quote. And that is from another nice guy, Julian Salvalescu. I debated him once. And he says that he acknowledges that the way to differentiate the cells, tissues, and organs that we want from embryonic stem cells is not going to be easy in the laboratory dish. But we do know that the microenvironment, the complex spatiotemporal dynamics of the living embryo can produce these desired medical products. And he says that because of the compelling good that could be produced from this, he says, quote, it is morally required that we employ cloning to produce embryos or fetuses for the sake of providing cells, tissues, or even organs for therapy. followed by abortion of the embryo or fetus. So I would leave you to with that question, and I would challenge some of our previous speakers in this conference to answer the question. Given your position on the moral standing of the human fetus for very high goods, like saving the life of a child, existing child, precious 3-year-old, for example, would we be willing to clone, implant, gestate, and harvest human fetuses? Thank you.
So now we have about 15 minutes for you to each ask follow-up questions or further comments on what we've heard so far.
Well, I would like to ask one question to Liz. You said that if there are fewer people with Downs, it will necessarily mean that there will be fewer advocates and resources devoted to people with disabilities, with this particular disability. I don't think that the evidence points in that direction at all. This whole discussion of prenatal testing and selective abortion comes about at a time when people with disabilities are living unprecedentedly good lives. We don't have nearly enough resources, but there are some. I remember, my daughter is now 40 years old. I remember what it was like 40 years ago when she was born. Those were the days of Willowbrook. And I could never have imagined at the time that I could never have imagined at the time that my daughter would have the kind of life she has. It was hard for me to imagine her as anything but a child, because the image of a grown person with severe cognitive disabilities was such an unattractive picture, such a sad and desolate one. So in light of the fact that there doesn't seem to be a correlation between reducing the number of disabled people there are, and we can abort every single disabled fetus and we'll still have people with disabilities. We're not going to start managing to have no accidents in our lives. So it doesn't seem to me to be the same kind of argument that is made on the basis of sex selection. Previously I did think it was, but when I considered that one aspect, I don't think it is equivalent to the argument against sex selection.
Well, what I have to say is that actually my intuitions, sadly, and my experiences confirm my statement that the decrease in number is resulting in decrease in resources. I have an older brother who is mentally disabled. He's 65 now, and I grew up with him. And I know that the pressure that my parents faced when he was born was the pressure to institutionalize him. And I know he was educated, he got a high school degree, he has a job, he contributes to our Social Security fund, he's living a life that is extraordinary, and my parents have been through that whole arc of the expansion of our views on the integration of people with disabilities. But now I have a son who has Down syndrome and autism and verbal apraxia. He doesn't speak. And I see my friends who have kids with just Down syndrome worrying very much about the shrinkage in group homes that are available, in the fact that they have to plan for whether they can pay their other kids' college tuition because they don't know whether they're going to have to be able to buy a house for their children because there's no social support for any kind of community living for their children. On the other hand, what is the one group of people with disabilities where there is more funding kind of flowing in? It's the group of people with autism, because there's such an exponential growth in the number of people with autism, people advocating for them. So I see, I have a different sense of the future and our social consensus and the resources that actually are being devoted to supporting life of people with disabilities, and I'm seeing this correlation in numbers.
I don't know if we will continue at another point.
Bill or Bernard, would you like to add anything?
Well, just to explore areas where there may be some minor agreement regarding how well we integrate and accommodate people with disabilities. For example, looking in this room, I don't see anyone in a wheelchair. Could someone confined to a wheelchair get into this auditorium? And if so, where yes, well, this is the very accommodation that has to be made. I'm used to facilities where ramps have had to be built and elevators for that purpose. If there's a projection onto the screen, could people in wheelchairs be situated where they could see the screen, or would they be on the margins? Would they be confined to the back? And how well we accommodate disabled people in the workforce and in a variety of functions is something that requires attention. I think the evidence is that disabled people suffer discrimination in employment unless there are positively enforced laws against that form of disability discrimination. Again, figures indicate from North America and Europe that their income levels are below those of normally abled people. Their duration in the workforce, their promotion through the ranks in the workforce tend to be prejudiced. These are matters that require positive remedy.
I have a question actually for Bernard, and maybe you could chime in too. And it has to do with your the last point you made in your talks about possibly distinguishing between testing for genetic enhancement versus testing for the presence of a disability. And this is an issue that Eva and I were talking about a little bit. Do you have an idea of how you would define what's an enhancement versus prevention of a disability? I think that one of the biggest mysteries, if you have a kid with a disability, one of the most difficult questions to answer is if you had a pill that would cure them, would you give it to them? It's a really, really hard question to answer, because there is a sense that you develop the longer you love somebody with a disability, that they are that person with that disability. That's who you love. And you see the value, as you started your remarks talking about differently abled people, you see the value of that spectrum of abilities. So how would you draw that line? I'm not, if I would enhance my son's, I don't know, if I would be curing him of his disability or enhancing him genetically, if I could cure his Down syndrome and autism, I don't know. But do you have any view of how you would define what's an enhancement versus any other?
I'm not certain one can define it in any rationally defensible way. These are areas of judgment and individual preference. Evidence is that taller people do better in life than shorter people. If one could enhance the stature of a child to make the child tall rather than of ordinary stature, would one think that was an appropriate use of technology? If one looks at the selection period at candidates for election, men with hair tend to do much better than men without hair. If one could find cures, I have no self-interest in this. If one could enhance, not by wigs, which is of course another easy strategy. If one could enhance hair growth, would one think that was something worth doing? Again, if one looks at the public spectrum of celebrities, they seem to have characteristics that do not include what would generally be regarded as disabilities. One would want to use technologies to give one's children these cosmetic advantages, supposing they would lead to substantive benefits. This is an area for judgment.
Just want to say about some of these cosmetic enhancements, as opposed to something like curing someone of Downs or somehow changing the cognitive capacity of the person. These are much more fundamental changes to the person that you're dealing with altogether. So I'm not sure, I'm not sure how significant those kinds of choices are, as opposed to choices, for example, that would importantly change one's cognitive abilities or one's psychological abilities. When I think of my daughter, I say to myself so often, and I don't say it with any kind of conscious, this is what I want to say, but I want to say, I'm so privileged to have her. Again, this is not something I would have thought when she was a baby. At that point, just the thought of her not living a normal life was enormously painful. But now that she's a grown woman, and the kind of spirit and quality that she gives to my life and she gives to those who come into our home is really something quite remarkable. And but I have that passage in the article that I wrote. If I could suddenly make her turn into a normal 40-year-old woman, would I do it? In some ways I think, well, of course I would. Because as a person with normal capacities, she has a much wider range to her life. But it would be a loss for me at the same time. I have to say that. It would be a gain and it would be a loss at the same time. But can I just take one moment to address this resource question? One thing about the autism situation is that most of the children who are born with autism aren't born, who become autistic sometime after the parent has already thought this was a child who's going to develop normally. And so I think two things happen around the question of activism in the autism situation. The parents have already made this kind of bond with the child and have presumed that something's gone wrong along the way. And the other thing is that we now have a culture of activism around disability, which we didn't have earlier on. So I think the great outpouring, and a lot of the money that goes into autism, you have to remember, is to try to cure autism, not to try to support the lives of a child as an autist. So I don't think the fact that we suddenly have a large population of autism and the resources are pouring in the way they're not pouring in for Downs really proves that much. I still think that people with Downs today are getting many more resources and many more possibilities. Of course, they're totally inadequate, but a white child with Downs today has a life expectancy of over 50. 50 years ago, it was like, I think, 11. 25 years ago, it was like 25. And black children with autism, by the way, have a much reduced life expectancy of something like half of white children. So, we could keep talking about this, but I think we need some good facts and figures, and I'm not sure we have them. I don't know if that answers them.
Bill, did you want to ask a question or add a comment?
I have some comments on this. Facts and figures. Let's talk about the science a little bit. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and its potentials and its pitfalls. And with regard to enhancement technologies, I think there's massive misunderstanding. First of all, with regard to many of the purposes for which pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is purported to be a benefit, there's a big question about that scientifically. Because for one thing, even where it's an identifiable single allele, I mean, it's a single focused gene defect that is promoting a disease, the actual phenotype, the expressed manifestation of the disease can be dramatically different even in identical twins. So the prediction power of this is not as great as you think it is, or as many think it is. Not only that, but most diseases are multigenic in cause. So autism, for example, we don't really know. There's some evidence of genetic groundings, but we don't really know what it might be, whether it's some environmental interaction or whether it's a determinative cause. Determination in the life of an organism is not the way it's been portrayed to us. And my own feeling as a physician is that this is all somewhat misconstrued. It turns out that most embryos have many disordered cells in them, and they migrate to the trophectoderm, which forms the placenta. There even seems to be some advantage in the placental function to have these disordered cells in them. So you do PGD, you may get a completely wrong impression of what the product in the womb is heading toward. Second, from a medical perspective and from a human perspective, I personally find this very hard-hearted. With regard to Down syndrome, there was a conference at Stanford where it was one of these public conferences where, they tout all the good work being done and then ask for donations. And somebody stood up and said, well, what are you doing about Down syndrome? And a physician responded, Madam, the answer to Down syndrome is abortion. The cure for Down syndrome is abortion. That is not the tradition in which I am trained. I'm a physician. A physician is a healing profession. And to just decide ahead of time that Down syndrome is an incurable disease is a false assumption. In fact, my former colleague, head of neurological sciences at Stanford, is studying Down syndrome from a compassionate perspective and finding identifiable targets for therapy. And then just a little comment on enhancement. Most of what we care about in enhancement, longevity, beauty, intelligence, these are caused by hundreds, if not thousands, of interacting genes. The idea that we're going to easily intervene to do these projects in the perfection of our species is scientifically very tenuous. And humanly, I personally think it's a huge mistake to turn progeny into products.
Bernard, did you want to give one last comment, and then we'll open up to audience Q&A. So if you want to start lining up, please.
Well, it's really a question for Eva, who's spoken about the privilege of bringing up her daughter. And I wonder how you would encourage couples to invest in realizing that promise.
How I would encourage people to invest in that promise. I think information is important. I don't know. I don't have, and looking for ways to support the child that can at the same time support the whole family, because I think we run into terrible difficulties when we're not supporting the whole family with a child with disabilities. I mean, I don't know how you, you know, like with your children, when they turn out good, you don't have any reason to take credit. You just have to thank goodness that you didn't spoil it. But, I mean, we have been incredibly fortunate in being able to have that kind of support. Most people don't. Most people struggle. Most people love their children just as much as I do.
Thank you. Start with Frances.
I was thinking about this question of the moral problematic that Elizabeth raises, and I wonder what you would say about the moral problematic of rejecting a disabled child after birth and putting it up for adoption. Do you see similar, putting aside the moral status of the fetus, the exercise of yesterday, do you see these two acts as significantly different in terms of their effect on the disabled?
So we'll have 4 questions, and then you can answer and address as you see best.
It seems to me that listening to these stories, I'm a physician, and I've counseled people, and I've seen the other side of this story where families get destroyed because of some of these children. With that in mind, I would like to ask the doctor, do you still see that it's so complex that choice has to be given to the family and to the patient as opposed to dictating or legislating what has to be done?
2 quick things. On what grounds in a pluralistic society do we claim the value of a severely mentally disabled child over an intelligent, healthy chimpanzee, dolphin, or dog? And secondly, what, if any, objective value is to stop us from creating human embryos, letting them grow into adults, and then harvesting organs rather than cells?
Becky Marchand from the World Youth Alliance. My question is for Ms. Kate. If our attitude towards disabled... Okay, hi. If our attitude towards the disabled in terms of law and policy is not based on the inherent dignity of and radical equality of disabled persons, then what, and you mentioned resources and devoting more resources, they're inadequate. How do we convince our lawmakers and policymakers, Congress, whatever, to devote more resources when it's cheaper and it's easier to allow, you know, in Europe, 92% to be aborted by their parents?
Okay, so we'll first take a crack at answering those 4, and if time remains, we'll take some more questions.
I'll begin. As far as the adoption issue, I think that's a very, very interesting question in terms of this expressivity question. But I think it brings out the problem, the whole notion of expressivity, taking this as, I mean, I think that the second argument that you mentioned, Lisa, is not really an expressivity argument. It's an argument about certain kinds of consequences of having a policy that allows this form of abortion. But it's not an expressivity argument. An expressivity, to express something means that there's a communicator. There's someone who sends out the message, and there's someone who receives the message. It means that there's a code in which that message is communicated. It means that there's a context in which people understand that code. And if you don't have those things, you don't have a message. And I think it is it's up to an individual as to how they see what their lives are like, what they can do, what they're capable of. I'd say the same thing about the second question, about the destruction of families. Interestingly, my son in that argument comes through at the end to say that, well, people make all sorts of rotten decisions about their children. And if they are thinking that they don't want a disabled person in their lives, then are we really better off by having families with disabled children who don't want these people in their lives? This also relates to the question of how do we convince our policymakers. How we convince our policymakers, I think, is to show what is possible in a disabled life. And people with disabilities are doing this. This is one very important thing. And that the quality of life can be good, that a person can contribute in the various ways people contribute. My daughter contributes not by earning any money. She contributes by the kind of joy and satisfaction she gives to people. And also, I think, by having people who do care work, whether it's for elderly people, whether it's for disabled people, whether it's for children, demand supports for care in this country. Women are not going to reach equality unless they have those supports for caregiving. People with disabilities are not going to reach equality unless they have those kinds of supports. So I would say we have to grow the movement beyond a small group to encompass a much larger population who needs public assistance.
I think I'll start with the way that you have responded to my suggestion that the expressivity argument includes as a second leg or as a different version of it, this idea that we're expressing a very strong social message that has nothing to do with the intentions of the particular individual people making those decisions. I think that clearly messages can be expressed about our social consensus. They are expressed regardless of the particular intentions of the people uttering making those acts. I think that there's no doubt that what anybody living with Down syndrome who is capable of hearing these statistics and these numbers and reflecting upon what that means, there's no doubt that what's being communicated to them is that we as a society, our social consensus that people with disabilities, or at least that particular disability that can be identified, are equal in value to other people. It's a very, very weak consensus. It's it's almost a sort of a variation of the not in my backyard kind of consensus. We all agree we do think people with disabilities should have equal access to our schools, our churches, our homes, our jobs, our public transportation. But when it comes to equal access to our families, to our homes, not as guests, But as people for whom we might be ultimately responsible, our social consensus and the message we're telling them is that we don't agree that you have that right. And I think that, I do not think that any particular woman making that decision is trying to say that. But I think collectively we have to recognize that is what we are saying about the value of people with disabilities in our community, whether we like that message or not. It's being expressed by our actions collectively. And so that's why I feel very strongly that there is an expressivist argument that's being made by these decisions that are all being made collectively. And then with respect to the distinction between rejecting a disabled child after birth, I don't see that as, I see that as you allow that child to live. And I see that all of us I would like to think that we would all have a stronger social consensus, that we all ought to be supporting that child after it's born. And we don't have that, and that scares me.
What would happen if 90% of the children born with Downs were being adopted?
One second, the men on this panel are being very chivalrous. Would you like to jump into the conversation?
Well, just to take up the issue that was raised at the end of the so-called therapeutic cloning, this goes to more fundamental issues of whether we have in fact artificially invested value in each embryo. We don't know the rate of spontaneous embryonic loss, failure, implantation, reabsorption and so forth, because we don't screen the menstrual flow of every sexually active woman of reproductive age. But the figures are, the latest figures I've seen are above 75%. Most embryos do not evolve to become you and me. Most are wasted in nature. And if nature doesn't value embryos except in aggregate terms, I wonder whether we aren't engaging in a fantasy of our own. The embryos are destined to be us if they are left to nature. If they're left to nature, they won't be. But if, for example, I am suffering from a terminal kidney disease, the idea of taking my cells, this of course depends on the technology being able to identify the triggering mechanism to produce particular organs. If an embryo could be developed, not to become a clone of me as a person, but to clone a specific organ, and it may be that this is a fantasy of what technology promises. But for example, the United Kingdom and Sweden have amended their laws to accommodate therapeutic cloning. Again, looking to the potential, if it were possible to clone the third kidney that I would need to survive, then I would regard that as beneficial, and I would think that was an appropriate use of technology and an appropriate dedication of an embryo, not wasting it, not salvaging it, but using it as part of therapy. And that, I think, could be of a considerable promise, and I would resist barriers to that potential development.
I'm sorry if I'm contradicting or not being consistent with what you said, but I can't hear what you're saying from where it is. The question was put to me directly, given the complexities of this favor individual choice. Well, in a society that has, in our current realities where there is abortion on demand with no reason given, it's pretty hard to imagine that we would impose laws about pre-implantation genetic diagnosis when it's such a much more difficult and poignant situation. But, and I'm not a political philosopher, I'm a physician. But from my perspective as a physician, let me say this, that I think that I feel like there's a moral wrong here. I don't feel good about this project. And I don't say this in a dispassionate, kind of coldly objective way. I say it as the father of a disabled child. Not a genetic disability, but my first little daughter, Sarah, because of a mistake in the hospital, they didn't get her heart beating for 9 minutes, so she suffered pretty bad brain damage. In fact, severe brain damage. And I've lived with this, and I know what it means. And I can say this, that in spite of the great difficulties it's entailed, I've experienced it, and so have my other children, as an invitation to go deeper into the heart of life. The question really comes down to is what is life for, and who decides? And that question does not reduce to some sort of simple cognitive equation. And I do not believe that consciousness, self-conscious awareness, particularly programs of future desires, are an adequate moral criterion for determining the value of a human life, or even the presence of a human life. In fact, I think the evidence of biology itself, the self-evident testimony of developing life, has a much more compelling meaning than this. And I think on the parallel concern about this is if you start defining the value of human life by something like consciousness, conscious capacities, I would just say, watch out. Because let me just read you two quotes. This is from Dominic Wilkinson at Oxford University, an ethics think tank. He says, "It may be that research using early human embryos is ethically preferable to research in animals, since it will not cause the research subjects to suffer, and research findings are more likely to be directly transferable to humans." Here's a quote from a Princeton philosophy professor, Elizabeth Harmon. It says, "In my view, fetuses that die before they're ever conscious really are a lot like plants. They're living things, but there's nothing about them that would make us think that they count morally in the way that people do." Now, you may think that the scenario I raised is unrealistic, but 7 years ago, scientists in Israel and Japan about the same time reported that they had cultured human embryos at the 7 to 8 cell stage. These are aborted embryos. They cultured kidney primordia, precursors to the kidney, and gotten functional kidney units that produce dilute urine. And Richard Gardner, a very famous developmental biologist, has now called for programs of the use of aborted fetuses to obtain embryonic parts or fetal parts for transplantation. This is very possibly realistic biology and science. So, the equation is this. You say that it's individual choice. You say that there is not a human person or a human value there until consciousness. Those kinds of individualized decisions and determinations could very easily spell venturing into privately chosen territory that I find deeply dehumanizing and eroding the fundamental moral structure of our civilization and our collective process as a human species.
So understanding that we're starting to invade the territory of lunch, we'll just hear very quickly 4 questions, and then if you can take 1 minute each to address the question you see best.
Can't hear you.
Test. Tim Likens, I'm a percussionist. Eva, you made a comment, a family starts at birth because up until that point, the child is wholly dependent on the mother. Isn't the child wholly dependent on someone until puberty or later, or possibly in your daughter's case, her whole life? Aren't we all still dependent on one another?
Mine is directed to Ms. Kate as well. It's actually on a similar issue. You said that as the unborn child is totally dependent on the mother, so she can make a decision as to end the pregnancy. In this interplay, the mother is entirely gratuitous. It's not a reciprocal kind of relationship, at least on an interdependent or material level. Does this imply some sort of Hobbesian sense of human value, namely that superiority is based on contribution?
Hi, Miriam Young with the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum and on the board of Generations Ahead. I want to first thank you for having a panel that really reflected the spirit of the conference. I was getting a little bit dismayed that we weren't keeping open hearts, open minds, and fair-minded words, and you guys really did that, and I appreciate that. I also was really glad to hear so much consensus that we need, I do have a question, that we need to address social justice for people living with disabilities, right? And that is the fundamental way forward, and there was vast agreement. So I wonder if you can transfer that to the idea of sexism, and if we because we glossed over sex selection in this conversation, and that the fundamental way to address sex selection or son preference is to tackle sexism. And furthermore, that some of the sex-selective abortion bans that we're seeing don't actually help us do that. They don't dismantle gender inequity at all.
Thank you. One last question.
I'm Isaac Woodward from Rutgers University, and this is for Ms. Kate. It's very similar to the last two about dependency, but it seems to me that generally we don't make distinctions on the essence of what a thing is regarding its dependency. So going back to the statement about the child being dependent on the mother, so that is why she has free reign over it. So would a nurse in a hospital that has sole control over a patient be able to decide the destiny of that person? So just kind of around those lines. Thank you.
So if we can answer the questions and include them in your concluding remarks, that'd be great. You have about 2 minutes each, or 1 minute each. Just go in order.
The achievement of social justice is, of course, a political problem that in modern times coincides with an economic problem. And I think the United States is somewhat different from Canada and many of the countries of Western Europe, where there is a sense of social solidarity. We have national health services under different sorts of organization. The delay in moving towards that in the United States and the continuing resistance to it is stunning in Canada. We cannot understand, except in terms of fierce individualism and the history of racism, why the United States, historically with apartheid South Africa, is a developed country that has resisted mobilizing social resources to deal with the less able, the deprived. And the question arose earlier of how one can apply resources to secure, to reinforce the dignity and the equality of the disabled. This requires political incentives that one doesn't see widespread in the United States. And this, I think, is an ongoing problem. It reinforces what is sometimes described as American exceptionalism. If one sees the main social trends in many parts of the economically developed world, one finds the United States an exception. And this is something of concern not just to the United States, but to the countries that economically and socially interact with the United States. That is, the tolerance of social inequality along gender, racial, and economic grounds is problematic.
It's funny that I was attacked on the issue of dependence, and most of my work has been on the importance of recognizing human dependency and talking against the kind of ideology of independence that fuels a lot of the resistance to the kinds of things that you were just talking about. It was a very brief statement because I was speaking about not quite that. But here's my line on that. Once the baby is born, the baby is of course dependent, but it's not necessarily dependent on the mother. Okay, so prior to birth, the baby, and certainly prior to viability, the baby is necessarily dependent on the mother. The period of, there's a sort of in-between period there where, you know, the baby could emerge and, but that still means the baby has to emerge. I mean, right? It has to be out of the woman's body for its dependency to be taken care of by someone other than the mother. Okay, that's what I meant. I certainly subscribe to nothing like a Hobbesian universe or the priority of intelligence or strength or anything of that sort. I think we're going to improve the human race if we care for dependence better. That's what improving the human race means to me.
I just want to put in a plug for everything that Eva has written on dependency, feminism, and the importance of dependency, and her eloquent, gracious ways in which she has revolutionized thoughts about feminism. And is Robin West, she'll be speaking later in the panel, is another one who have done extraordinary work. And if anybody out there hasn't read those works of these two incredible women on the issues of dependency, feminism, and the importance of dependency, and the attacks on sort of autonomous notions of justice that have dictated, I think, the course of society that we find ourselves living in right now, then you should go out and read it. In the response to the question about sexism, I think that's absolutely true. I think that Bernard is right that in the United States here, we're not really faced as much with it. We're not seeing that message being sent. But in the countries where we are, absolutely, we need to defend the dignity and the equal worth of women in order to change some of those policies and those and the message that's being sent there in China, at least by government fiat, about the relative worth of women and men, and it's enforced and operationalized through abortion policy.
Well, in a broad sense, when I was asked to be a member of the President's Council of Bioethics, I didn't actually have my mind made up on issues related to very early embryo. And so I did a lot of talking and thinking, and the more I looked deeply into developmental biology, the more I developed deep concerns about the whole fundamental premise of our current laws and social attitudes toward abortion and the ancillary implications of evaluating the status of developing life in a particular way. I mean, just let me cite a few of the things that are now evident in developmental biology. By 6 weeks, there are spontaneous and reflexive movements, withdrawal of the head, for example, if the mouth is touched. By 7 weeks, there are hiccups, leg movements, and a startle response. By 8 weeks, 75% of embryos are either right-handed, expressing right-handed preference. 8 weeks. By 9 weeks, there's sucking, swallowing, grasp of objects, sighs, and stretches. 10 weeks, yawning, sucking the thumb. 16 weeks, stress response, with increase in adrenaline and noradrenaline in response to a provocation. By 19 weeks, there's circadian rhythms. And by early in the third trimester, there is smiling and crying with real tears. I'm very comfortable with the social attitudes toward developing life that prevail in our society. And I'm most uncomfortable because I think there's a fundamental premise going on that is not just a private choice matter, but a social disposition that is potentially very damaging and dehumanizing. Now, I know it's against the rules to cite Nazi realities, but today's New York Times has a front page story describing the wider circle of consent that was public and the attitudes of physicians that allowed what happened to happen. And the guy who wrote much of the Nuremberg Code, Leo Alexander, wrote a very compelling essay called Medicine Under a Dictatorship. And in it he said, whatever proportions these crimes finally assume, it's evident to all who investigated them that they started from small beginnings. The beginnings at first were merely a subtle shift in emphasis in the basic attitude of the physicians. In that case, it was, of course, that there was such a thing as a life not worth living. In our society, it's the idea that you're not human, until you've expressed certain characteristics. Now, I know there are very, very serious moral issues here, and I think it's a big failure of our civilization not to address the root causes that promote abortion and the situations of abortion. And in that, I'm really on board with what's been said here. But I'm very uncomfortable with the kind of answers we're providing in our current civilization. As a physician, parent of a handicapped child, and member of our civilization, I think we should listen to the words of C.S. Lewis, that we should answer all of our problems with more love, not less love.
Great, thank you very much.